Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 100th coffee morning. So a momentous occasion. The coffee mornings have really been kind of a big part of the lifeblood of the Earth Institute over the last 2 or 3 years, and they're always an enjoyable part of a Thursday morning. So it's really nice to see you here. I would like to start really just by thanking all the members of the Institute community who've spoken at one of the coffee mornings since 2017. And particularly also to Aoife Cochrane and Philip Crow, who first got the coffee mornings going. And it's really nice to see Aoife again. I hope you're doing well in your new role and enjoying life. Good to catch up at some point.
Yeah, definitely. Hi guys, hi everyone.
Also to thank all of the people that have made them happen. It's great. Actually, Kira is here as well. I was going to give a shout out to as well. So thanks to Kira and Emily and Roisin, who've really made sure that the mornings have run so seamlessly. And also to my colleagues on the Institute Executive Committee for sharing duties at various times. And finally, of course, to everyone who's come along over the years to make this such an enjoyable regular feature of life. I'm very much looking forward, of course, to getting back to the Earth Institute kitchen area soon, the kind of physical home of the coffee mornings, and to actually eating cake and drinking coffee with everybody. But for now, we continue to exist in our online world, and thankfully we have the prospect of some really great coffee mornings to come, starting, of course, with this one. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Hannah Boast this morning from the School of English Drama and Film. Hannah's a very recent appointment to UCD's academic staff. She just joined us in September and is still living remotely in London. She's an Ad Astra Fellow, and she's already helped me out with a really thought-provoking presentation to our Stage 1 sustainability students. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about her work on the cultural aspects of politics of water in Palestine and Israel this morning. So I'll hand it over to Hannah without further ado. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Taz. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, here we are. Okay, thanks so much for having me today. It's been really great to have the Earth Institute as a way to get to know people doing interesting environmental related research since I joined in September. It's been a bit difficult. It would have been more difficult otherwise during a pandemic. So I'm grateful to Taz and to everyone at the Earth Institute for connecting me with people at UCD. So as Taz said, I work on hydropolitics in contemporary world literature and culture, and I've got a particular interest in Palestinian and Israeli writing. My first book, called Hydrofictions, Water, Power and Politics in Israeli and Palestinian Literature, came out with Edinburgh University Press last summer. Today, I'm going to introduce some of the themes of my work, and then I'm going to talk through some images that I think exemplify some of those themes in interesting ways. So, Palestine and Israel seems to be at the centre of a lot of our anxieties, but also our hopes about the future of the world's water. The region is often seen as the archetypal water war, with past, present and future conflicts regularly framed as motivated by the need to secure scarce supplies. Another thing that often comes up in the media is stories from Gaza about the territory's acute water shortage and its impact on Palestinian lives, with Gazan experiences sometimes presented as foreshadowing a future that will come for the world more widely in the wake of climate change. At the same time, Israel is often portrayed as having solved its water crisis through technological innovation like drip irrigation, wastewater recycling and desalination, with Israel's experiences apparently promising that we can just continue our lives as normal. So water in Israel-Palestine is often understood in quite narrowly technical and managerial terms, as a substance that's naturally scarce and it's the responsibility of politicians, science and engineers on their own to sort out. But I think that we need to expand the range of perspectives that we include when we're talking about water in this region, and also more broadly. So something that I look to in my research is to how literature and culture can tell us about what geographers often call hydrosocial relations. And I think that by doing that, we can unearth different dimensions of how hydropolitics shapes Israeli and Palestinian lives. And we can also use that to try and work towards imagining more just water futures. So the title of my book is Hydrofictions. So I propose this idea as a way of drawing attention to the presence of water in literature. My inspiration for this is the idea of petrofiction and petrocriticism, which have been quite popular in literary studies over the past 5 to 10 years. And those are part of a project of looking for how oil shapes our lives and subjectivities. So my work is broadly situated within this wider turn to resources in literary studies. So I'm going to turn to a couple of examples to try to illustrate some of what I mean and to give a sense of what the concrete meaning of this work is.
Sorry, Hannah, to interrupt. Have you been advancing slides? Because they haven't been changing on the screen.
No.
Okay, cool.
No, I've only got 3 slides. I should have explained that, but yeah.
No, you're right.
So I'm just going to go into the second one. So mostly I work on literature, but I'm using visual examples today because I think they just work better in this short format. But also there's loads of really amazing images about water and environment in Israel and Palestine that I don't get the chance to talk about that often. So my first example is this poster produced around 1955 for the Jewish National Fund, or JNF, by the artist David Zak. So the Hebrew text at the top says the JNF's name in Hebrew, Keren Kayem Etel Israel. And the text at the bottom says Mishamama Lemakom Yeshuv, which means from a wasteland to a settlement. So the Jewish National Fund was an agency established, I think, in 1902 in the early 20th century to buy land in Palestine for Jewish colonization. It's known in the diaspora for its blue boxes, which were used to collect donations to send to Israel to redeem the land. So in recent years, it's positioned itself more as an environmental organization and has rewritten some of this history in terms of environmental projects. So the JNF was also heavily involved in Zionist education, which included producing posters like this one, which were often used for display in classrooms. And there's a really great book about the JNF and Zionist education by Yoram Bar-Gal. So in this poster, we've got a page being turned from left to right, with an image on the right of empty brown scrubland filled with thorns. And this is peeled away to reveal the straight lines of these multicolored, fairly green fields, and these kind of neat little houses, and these kind of tall European-like trees of this kibbutz. And we've got a water tower at the back, sort of in the middle on the left, just below the top of the hill, which is sustaining everything below it. The water tower crops up really frequently in these early to mid 20th century images of the kibbutz. So in this poster, Israeli farming is depicted as an improvement and modernization of the unruly Palestinian landscape. The kibbutz has transformed this seemingly unproductive, arid, and crucially empty Middle Eastern landscape into a Europeanized and well-watered one, showing both the technological skill of the kibbutzim, but also the Israeli right to the land. So Zak's image is literally a turning over of a page, the creation of a new era, suggesting that the main constraint on what can happen is imagination. So this tells us something interesting about how early Zionist thinkers and politicians often saw the role of the environment in their project, as able to be subordinated to national ends, or even as on the side of the Zionist project because of the connection between the Jewish people and their historic homeland. So my next image is a far more recent one. It's a photograph which is on the cover of my book, by the Jordanian photographer Tanya Habjuka, and it was taken in the West Bank in 2013. And I was really happy to be able to get this on my book because I just love the photograph. So it's part of the series Occupied Pleasures, which puns on the double meaning of to be occupied by Israel, but also to occupy oneself. And as Habjuka writes, joyfully and defiantly in pastime and simple pleasures. The series is concerned with the ways in which the occupation makes itself apparent in disruptions to ordinary everyday life. And the images are often inflected with a little bit of an absurd sensibility. So I really love this image and the others in the series for offering a different perspective on Palestinian life, while also playing with older tropes of Palestinian representation. And I think this playing with tropes is another way, another source of the pleasures that Hydrofictions is indicating in the title. So in this image, we have this rocky landscape and a beautiful blue sky with a huge old olive tree at the center and 3 boys in a paddling pool underneath, just off center. And the olive tree, of course, is this constant symbol in Palestinian art and literature. It's something that symbolizes the historic connection between Palestinians and their land, their rootedness over time. And it suggests more traditional nationalist representations. And the paddling pool is a bit more unexpected. It suggests the well-known problems with water access in the West Bank within this rocky, arid landscape, but its own bright blue color and the fish prints on its sides are kind of more incongruous and a bit jaunty. The children at play contrast with the more familiar representations of Palestinian children as distressed, found in media and NGO reporting. But at the same time, the paddling pool, I think, is a reminder of the swimming pools in West Bank settlements, which are a kind of pleasure to which Palestinians don't have access. So by depicting Palestinian play, I think this image counters the tragic discourse often used to narrate Palestinian lives. And that's a phrase that I take from Laila Khalili. At the same time, through evoking absent swimming pools, I think the image suggests that the limits on Palestinian water supply in the West Bank are more political than natural in origin. So I hope this has given a little bit of a sense of my work. And if you work on related topics at UCD, I'd love to talk more. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Hannah. Really striking images, I thought, especially the kind of the turning over of the page was a really clever representation. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions they wanted to ask? I was curious, I guess, to ask. Oh, sorry, yeah, there's one there from.
Oh, sorry. Hi,
Hannah.
Hi.
Thanks very much for that. Yeah, nice to see you. Yeah, sorry, I was just struck me. I was wondering about the first image you showed and how that might have intersected with like ideas around Palestine as like a deserted, like uninhabited land. Like I was just thinking there of like Joan Peters, the From Time Immemorial book, which was, yeah, about like demography and the idea that there was no one living in Palestine, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the image that it presents of Palestine before before Jewish settlement and then the creation of Israel is just this kind of empty, arid land with nothing going on. It's uncultivated, and it's there for the taking because it's not being used. It's not being made productive. And that's quite common in propaganda images from that time. So the book is the poster is from, as I mentioned on the slide, it's from the Palestine Poster Project Archives, which is a really amazing website that has loads of these kinds of images from the time up to the present day. And yeah, it really seems to exemplify that trope of land without a people for a people without a land. Yeah, so you're absolutely right in picking that out.
Thanks. Yeah.
Anybody else? I guess I was kind of curious to hear more of your thoughts on the role that you feel these kind of cultural representations have played in the conflict and its kind of ebb and flow towards and away from resolution. I guess there's a sense in which they can be stabilizing in some circumstances and another sense in which they can be provocative in others. So have you kind of explored the degree to which they've been influential or influenced by the conflict at different stages.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say about that. I'm just trying to think what's the most useful and interesting thing to talk about. I mean, I suppose the first image, that's something that's kind of part of the JNF kind of educational project. So those kinds of images would have been up in school classrooms in the first few years of the Israeli state. So there's obviously a way that culture is being used there to kind of inculcate a certain kind of Israeli sensibility as kind of pioneers, as kind of shaping the land, making it productive where before it might have been kind of a desert that was uninhabited. So that's kind of about inculcating a kind of Israeli culture in a sense of the sort of national narrative of kind of triumphing over nature and mastery of the land and that kind of thing. So there's that sense of culture is creating a national sensibility, but also obviously those ideas circulate outside Israel, as I kind of gestured to at the start, of kind of producing an image of Israel as a state that kind of has these technological solutions that it can use to help combat climate change. Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in how representations of Israelis and Palestinians as sort of connected to nature are used to shape international, their kind of image internationally, and how that kind of it kind of makes us want to align with particular sides. So kind of Israel might present itself as kind of a kind of sorry, I'm kind of losing my words, but it kind of presents itself as kind of more environmentalist, and that kind of aligns with European and American sensibilities, and that kind of plays a particular role in gaining political support. And then Palestinians will kind of have their own version of that narrative, where Israel is a kind of alien intruder in the land, and Palestinians' sort of long-standing connection through things like olive trees has been disturbed by Israel's sort of unnatural presence. So I guess a way to summarize what I'm saying is that these representations get used internally to construct a kind of national culture, but they're also used to present a particular image of the nation internationally. And yeah, literature and culture is really important to that.
Yeah, and absolutely. No, I think it's really interesting, and I think it's a kind of a particularly interesting situation there with the political aspect to it, a very strong, striking, powerful political aspect to it, which you kind of explored really nicely there. I mean, but it's also something that I think is very interesting here, let's say, in Europe, where culture is both reflecting and influencing the way in which we perceive and engage with the environment, and it's quite a powerful force in shaping those views, but often kind of overlooked. I think it's one that we kind of tend to take for granted. I don't know if you want to comment more on outside that conflict situation, which is so politicized, just in the more kind of environmental sense, the way it's influencing our environmental sensibilities elsewhere.
Yeah, I suppose one thing that I might just add is that the images that I discussed in this kind of quite brief talk is that are ones that are very broad brushstrokes in terms of the kind of quite obvious nationalist narratives and sensibilities that they present. But literature and culture can often help us to see sort of perspectives that go a bit more under the radar. And I think that's one of the really important things that literature can do. So while I'm talking about like olive trees and the empty land and that sort of thing, there are more unusual narratives that we can also find through turning to literature.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one of the questions questions cropped up from Tamara saying thanks for the talk, very interesting. Do you have any work in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not working on Irish literature at the moment, but I'm hoping to bring it in future work. I know Sheree's here, and I think Sheree's written on water politics in Ireland. Michael Rubinstein has also done some work on Irish water infrastructure in literature. And people keep recommending loads of really interesting sounding Irish texts to me. So I think it's inevitably going to end up being part of my work. I mean, one thing that's caught my attention is the Shannon hydroelectric scheme, and kind of I'm interested in these kind of big water projects, kind of mega projects, dam construction, and how they're related to ways of understanding the nation and kind of post-colonial understandings of the nation. So yes, I think it's inevitable that I'm going to end up writing about Irish water. And of course the privatisation disputes as well in recent years are really fascinating.
I think that's fascinating as well, yeah. Sheree, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wondered if, Hannah, maybe you could just expand a little bit more on what you were talking about at the beginning, about the ways in which, like, the kind of notions, technocratic notions of water management can be utilized often alongside discourses of water security in ways that are very politically unjust. So I know that's something you're wrestling with, not just in the context of Palestine and Israel and a context of what has been called water apartheid or hydrocolonialism, but it obviously speaks to the larger use of discourses, including in things like the Horizon EU kind of funding frameworks, which are often talking about water security. Like, how does your work kind of illuminate why sometimes these kind of frameworks of securitization might be problematic, and how we need to think through how we do have equitable and democratic access to water, not just in contexts that are often portrayed as being arid or desertified, but wherever it is in the world. But we need a better kind of understanding of this that doesn't fall back into those kind of security and water wars frameworks. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Sheree. That's a really good question. And you're right that this is something that I'm wrestling with. I mean, it's hard to know what to do with these kinds of alarmist representations of environmental crisis and of climate change. I mean, crisis is one of these terms that we use a lot, or emergency, sort of water wars, and the kind of security language. I mean, David Attenborough was in the news last week talking about climate change as the greatest threat to human security. I'm sure some of you will have seen that. And there's obviously an appeal to those kinds of narratives because they kind of hopefully funnel support towards trying to combat things like climate change, and they get people's attention. But of course, they're also a massive simplification that in many ways is not that helpful. Often these ideas kind of end up, they make it look like scarcity is just a necessarily natural condition of the world, and that humans are always going to kind of fight over water, and they sort of seem to lead to particular understandings of human nature and of where water shortages come from, that ignore the political dimensions of where water shortages also come from. And I mean, Israel and Palestine is a really stark example of that. So I'm just trying to circle back to where your question. I suppose one of the things that literature and culture are really good for doing are kind of foregrounding how things that we just assume are natural and maybe not completely natural, through kind of unpacking these ideas at greater length. So that's something that I'm trying to do in my current work at a kind of broader scale, looking at ideas of water crisis and water shortages over a kind of broader international comparative context. Yeah, thanks, Sheree.
So I think that's interesting, and that kind of relates in a way to one of the take-home messages that the sustainability students got from your talk, was in the sense that, you know, those kind of dystopian, crisis-laden representations lead to kind of polarization, lead to kind of quite extreme views, and quite a sense that it's ultimately going to be every person for themselves, and doesn't lead to a kind of subtle constructive dialogue about how we can work together to try and improve things in the short term. I thought that was a really striking kind of observation. And as you say, there's a lot more under the surface.
There's lots of good suggestions, reading recommendations in the
I saw that,
in the chat. Talking about Michael Rubinstein's book Public Works, on Ardna Kushner, Patrick Bresnahan's work on water infrastructure in Ireland, which I'm familiar with, which is also really great. And Solar Bones, yeah, that's an amazing novel. About water contamination in Dublin. And sort of yeah, it's kind of horrible. And there's a kind of really interesting connection in that book between the way that it's written, between the literary form, which is kind of all one sentence, and the kinds of connections that it's trying to portray between individual bodies and the kind of urban body through the way that water contamination travels and kind of poisons everyone in the book. Cool. So yeah, recommended reading for anyone interested in Irish water.
Any other comments anyone would like to make out loud, as it were, the questions? Absolutely, there's a lot of good stuff in the chat there for further reading. Okay, well, if there aren't any additional comments, I'd like to thank Hannah very much indeed for being our 100th Coffee Morning speaker and for a really interesting perspective on kind of political and environmental challenges and how cultural representations can influence them. So thanks very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks.